He put the divorce papers on the kitchen table while our newborn was still in the hospital bassinet down the hall, and the first thing he said wasn't, "I'm sorry," or "We need to talk." It was, "You knew this was always a possibility." I was still in a wheelchair. I had a catheter bruise on the back of my hand. And my husband of 11 years was telling me that having a fourth daughter instead of a son had been, in his words, the final straw. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that, because for a long time afterward I felt guilty that I didn't cry. I just looked at the papers, then at him, and asked the only question that made sense to me right then. "Did you already have a lawyer before I gave birth?" He didn't answer. He straightened his jacket and left the room, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a decision. This was a plan that had been waiting for me to deliver the baby so it could finally move forward. My name is Rachel Whitfield. I'm 36 years old. I live outside Columbus, Ohio, and 3 years ago I found out that my husband had been planning our divorce since before our youngest daughter was born. Derek and I met in college at Ohio State, in a business statistics class neither of us wanted to be in. He was funny back then, the kind of funny that makes a quiet girl feel seen. I was studying accounting. He was pre-law and switched to sales halfway through, which should have told me something about follow-through, but I was 20 and in love, so it didn't. We got married when I was 25. Our first daughter, Emma, came 2 years later. Then Lily. Then Grace. Each time I was pregnant, Derek would joke with his brothers about trying again for the boy, and I'd laugh along because that's what you do. You laugh along. You don't want to be the wife who can't take a joke. By the third daughter, the joke had a different texture to it. His mother, Carol, stopped saying congratulations and started saying, well, maybe next time. At Thanksgiving that year, Derek's older brother Mark toasted to somebody in this family finally carrying on the Whitfield name, and everyone laughed except me. I remember looking down the table at my 3 little girls in their matching dresses, coloring on the paper tablecloth, and feeling something crack quietly in my chest. I told myself it was just old-fashioned family stuff. Derek's dad had run a small HVAC company for 30 years and always talked about handing it down to a son. I told myself Derek didn't actually think that way, that he was just performing for his family the way we all perform sometimes. I believed that because I needed to. I found out how wrong I was on a Tuesday in March, 6 months before Grace was born, when I was folding laundry and his phone buzzed on the nightstand with a text preview I wasn't trying to see. It was from a number saved as K. Jim. If it's another girl, are you actually going to leave or just talk about it again, LOL? I stood there holding one of his undershirts for what felt like a full minute. Then I put the phone back exactly where it had been and finished the laundry, because I was 7 months pregnant with our 4th child and I did not know what else to do with my hands. I want to tell you I confronted him that day. I didn't. I told myself I needed proof, that one text out of context wasn't enough, that I couldn't blow up my family over a message I might be misreading. What I actually needed was time to be brave, and I didn't have it yet. I watched him differently after that. I noticed how he'd take calls in the garage with the door shut. How his gym schedule had crept from 3 days a week to 6. How he'd started using a password on a phone that used to just unlock with his thumb. Grace was born on a Thursday in September. For pounds 11 ounces, 5 weeks early, healthy but small, and I remember the nurse placing her on my chest and Derek standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, looking at his phone instead of his daughter. "Another girl," he said. Not to me. Just out loud to the room. I didn't say anything. I was too tired, too stitched up, too busy falling in love with the tiny person on my chest to argue with the man standing 6 feet away from both of us. He left 2 days later, while Grace and I were still in the hospital. Not left the marriage yet, left the building. Told the nurse he had a work thing. I found out afterward, from my sister-in-law of all people, that he'd spent that afternoon at a house across town. A house I didn't know he had access to. A house that belonged to a woman named Caitlin Duras. Caitlin. K, from the gym. He filed for divorce 9 days after Grace came home. I was still bleeding, still healing, still waking up every 2 hours to feed a newborn. And I was served papers by a process server who rang my doorbell at 8 a.m. while I had spit up on my shoulder and 3 other kids arguing over cereal in the kitchen behind me. Here's what I didn't know yet, and what took me 4 months of quiet, careful digging to find out. Derek hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been building an exit for over a year. Caitlin worked in medical device sales, made close to double what Derek did, and had no children and, according to the one honest conversation I ever had with his brother Mark, didn't want any complications. Derek had told her more than once that he was staying with me for the kids and that he'd leave as soon as it made sense financially. The 4th daughter was supposed to be his out. If it had been a boy, I genuinely think, he might have stayed a while longer, performed happy family for a few more years. A 4th girl gave him a story he could tell himself and his family. I tried. It just wasn't in the cards. Like I was a slot machine that kept coming up wrong instead of the mother of his children. I found bank statements showing transfers to an account I didn't recognize, going back 14 months, totaling almost $38,000. Money from our joint savings, the fund we'd told each other for years was for the girls' college. He'd been quietly draining it and rerouting it into an account tied to Caitlin's name on a joint lease for an apartment neither of us had ever lived in. I sat at my kitchen table with Grace asleep in the bassinet beside me, going through 6 months of statements line by line, and for the first time since the papers landed on my table, I stopped feeling sad. I started feeling something a lot more useful. I hired a lawyer named Patricia Alvarez, recommended by a coworker who'd gone through her own divorce 2 years earlier. Patricia was not warm. She did not tell me everything would be okay. What she told me in our first meeting was this: Ohio is an equitable distribution state. If he moved marital funds into a solo account in anticipation of divorce, that's dissipation of marital assets, and courts do not like that. Do you have documentation? I put a folder on her desk. Bank statements. Screenshots of the one text I'd seen and never mentioned. A timeline I'd built at 2 a.m. between feedings, matching Derek's, work trips to hotel charges near Caitlin's apartment complex. Patricia looked through it for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked up at me and said, "You built a better case than most attorneys hand me." I didn't feel proud. I felt sick, honestly, seeing 11 years of my marriage laid out like evidence in a fraud case. But I also felt, for the first time in months, like the ground under me was solid. The custody mediation was where I saw Derek's real face for the first time in years. He showed up with a lawyer of his own, a sharp, expensive-looking man who opened by suggesting that given my postpartum condition, it might be healthier for the children if Derek had primary custody while I focused on stabilizing. I understood immediately what was happening. Derek wasn't trying to get more time with our daughters. He barely wanted the time he already had. He was trying to reduce his child support obligation and make himself look like the responsible parent for his family's sake, particularly for his mother, Carol, who I later learned had told her church group that I'd had some kind of breakdown after the baby. I hadn't had a breakdown. I'd had a newborn, 3 other children under 9, and a husband who left me for a woman he'd been quietly paying rent for out of our savings account. Patricia didn't raise her voice. She just slid a folder across the table. "Before we discuss custody," she said, "I want to enter into record a summary of $37,800 in marital funds transferred by Mr. Whitfield to an account jointly held with Ms. Caitlin Duras, beginning 14 months prior to the filing of this petition. We'll also be requesting the court review hotel and travel charges during the same period." I watched Derek's face change. Not shock, he knew what he'd done. It was the specific stillness of a man watching a story he'd been telling everyone, including himself, come apart in real time. His lawyer asked for a recess. Here's the part I'm proudest of, and it has nothing to do with the courtroom. During the recess, Derek followed me into the hallway. No lawyers, no witnesses, just us standing by a water fountain in a county building that smelled like carpet cleaner. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. "The account thing. That's just going to make this uglier. You made an account with another woman's name on it while I was pregnant with your daughter," I said. "I didn't make it ugly, Derek. I just wrote it down. He rubbed his jaw the way he used to when he was building up to an apology he had no intention of finishing. I never stopped loving the girls. I know, I said, and I meant it. This was never about the girls. He didn't have an answer for that. For once in 11 years, he didn't have anything smooth to say. I left him standing by the water fountain and went back into the mediation room, and something in me that had been holding its breath for over a year finally let go. The financial outcome wasn't dramatic. I want to be honest about that too, because I know some of you want a courtroom scene where he's let out in handcuffs, and that's not what happened, because that's not how divorce works, and I'm not going to pretend it does. What happened was this. The court found that Derek had dissipated marital assets, and I was awarded a larger share of what remained to offset it. I kept the house, which had been in my name since before the marriage anyway, something Derek had conveniently forgotten when he assumed I'd be too overwhelmed to fight. He was ordered to pay child support based on his actual income, not the reduced number his lawyer tried to argue for. And the $37,800 became part of the settlement calculation instead of quietly disappearing into an apartment lease. He didn't go to prison. Nobody clapped. His mother didn't call to apologize, she still hasn't, 3 years later, though she does send birthday cards to the girls now, which I let happen because it's not their fault whose son their father is. The real consequence, the one that actually mattered, happened slowly, the way real consequences usually do. Caitlin left him 8 months after the divorce was finalized. I heard about it from Mark, who I'd stayed in touch with because, unlike his mother, he'd never once pretended what Derek did was fine. Apparently, the no complications relationship got complicated fast once Derek's income dropped from the support order and the family stopped inviting him to things the way they used to, once the story around town shifted from poor Derek couldn't get a son to something closer to the truth. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard. I felt tired, in the good way, like setting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. I want to tell you about a Tuesday about a year after the divorce was final, because it's the moment I actually understood what had changed. Grace was 18 months old, walking, saying a few words. Emma, Lily, and Grace were all watching a movie in the living room while I made dinner, and my oldest, Emma, wandered into the kitchen and asked me, completely out of nowhere, "Mom, are you happy?" She was 9. I don't know what made her ask. Maybe she'd overheard something at her dad's place. Maybe kids just know. I thought about lying, the way I'd gotten so good at lying to keep the peace for so many years. Instead, I told her the truth. I am, I said. It took me a while, but yeah, I really am. She nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable answer and went back to the movie, and I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand, crying for the first time since the papers had landed on my kitchen table, except this time it wasn't grief. It was just relief, finally finding somewhere to land. I still see Derek at pickups and school events. We're civil. He's better with the girls now than he was in those last years of our marriage, and I've stopped needing him to be worse than that just to feel justified in what happened. His guilt is his to carry, not mine to manage. People ask me sometimes if I regret not confronting him the day I found that first text. I don't, not really. I think I needed that time to become someone who could survive what came after, someone who could sit at a kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a newborn beside her and build a case instead of a breakdown. He thought a 4th daughter was the end of something. It turned out to be the beginning of the only version of my life I actually wanted to live. Emma, Lily, Grace, and their little sister Nora, who came along 2 years after the divorce from a relationship I'm not ready to talk about yet, but am genuinely happy in, the 4 of them are the reason I don't spend much time being angry anymore. He left thinking he was losing nothing but a chance at a son. He had no idea what he actually walked away from.